I'm Sól Ey, or usually just use my artist name Sól Ey, and I'm a composer, media artist, and performer. For me, I try to mix different mediums, such as sound and visuals, to create multisensory experiences, and often considering the role of the audience in the piece. I think art has always been a part of my life. I cannot think of any particular moment that was the first one. And I did a lot of, from a very young age, some this kind of music play classes. And my mom also is an architect, so she would always she always made sure me and my sister would paint on white paper, not in the sketchbooks. And she would never she never wanted to tell us what to do. She would just ask questions. So like if there was the ears were missing, she would just ask, oh, he cannot hear anything. Can he? But yeah, maybe my first like significant connection that I can remember was I did like a music preschool where we learned mainly to play the recorder when I was 6 years old. And you were supposed to do this for 2 years, but then when I was turning 7, we got to try out all the instruments. And I tried the cello, and I was so fascinated with the vibrations of it that you could really feel the pulses in it. So so then I picked the cello, and I was allowed to start 1 year earlier because I liked it so much. So yeah, maybe that was my first moment for me. And was doing a lot of music classes. I was doing cello and singing and electronic music and a lot of music theory all at the same time. I did that because then I started at the Icelandic University of the Arts, and I did like 1 year of composition. And then I completely took a U-turn and was like, what am I doing with my life? And had the early quarter-life crisis maybe. And I spent a year in Berlin, which I think was really good because the scene in Iceland is very small. And I think also the idea of what a composer can do is rather limited. It's very hard to be experimental. So I moved to Berlin and sort of discovered media art as a scene and not as a, maybe media art as thing that people take seriously, because I had only seen like experimental electronic works that were a joke, or they didn't kind of work, and that was funny. So I in Berlin realized like, okay, this is actually something I really like, but I haven't seen it in Iceland before. Then I somehow ended up doing composition again, but with a very different mindset, and did a lot of studied composition at the Royal Conservatory in The Hague, and I also did a lot of classes at the Institute of Sonology. And then I actually a couple of years ago also started like a media art collective in Reykjavik, with the goal of like trying to build a scene for this scene that I never encountered before I moved to Berlin. Yeah, I think my creative process really depends on the piece, because I have been making a lot of music, but I'm moving more to these interdisciplinary things. But I think at the moment where I'm now, I have realized that I think very much in gestures and relationships. So gestures not as only movement, but also like sound or musical gestures or visual ones, or movement also. And I'm always thinking of like the relation of, so if I find something interesting, I explore it, but I'm always thinking of it like, how is it in relation to the space? In what like perspective am I looking at it, or what perspective am I listening to it? So I'm always trying to think like, what is the relationship with the elements that I'm using? So in that sense, I think it's important to think also that like I'm a lot more now working with it. It's like sound is just a part of the process, but it's not necessarily the starting point. It often is, and then it's like sound in relation to, and then there are other parameters, but it's sometimes also coming just as one part of the relationship. I think very conceptually, and I'm very much of like writing ideas in a lot in words, and then trying to think how do I bridge this together. So very often like the pieces coming together on all elements, and then it's kind of like becomes like a painting by numbers process of like filling in like, oh, I need to make some chords here because that kind of fills in the frame, or like, oh, there needs to be some color here, or like it really varies. But I think also like I enjoy mostly when I have really long time to try things out and not just make a piece and then it's finished. I feel like I usually make like 3 attempts to make the same piece to finally figure out like what I am actually looking for, because you make something and then you realize like actually the best way to convey this message is this way, and then you make another piece with the same idea. I do work a lot in collaborations. I think it's very important to get input from other people, both to just try out things practically, but also just like in the creative process to like brainstorm together. So yeah, and I also work a lot in collaborations with other artists, like a lot with dancers and also visual artists and performance artists. And so yeah, I think that always gives like a different perspective of how you think of your process. Because when I think of like blocks or difficulties in my process, I don't necessarily see it as a problem unless there's time difficulties. But I thought of it this way, that like I don't believe in geniuses, like, and I don't believe, well, okay, of course it works for some people, but I have a hard time thinking of that like you could just sit alone in isolation and be creative. For me, like the inspiration always comes from the outside world, both like just from life and also of course from other artworks and different disciplines and just from human relationships. So I feel like when I'm stuck, I mean, the most important thing is just to walk away from the piece and do something else. So like can be inspiration from other people. I get very inspired by books, like nonfiction, philosophy, but also like also not super philosophical, but yeah, so often I read or just like, yeah, just go outside. I feel like the best way to release a block is just to get some other perspectives. The piece Light Again, it's mainly about dynamics, and so the relationships and between sound and light and gesture and stillness. And I think of it just very much as all the elements that are used in the piece are instruments. They're all performed. So there is light in the piece, as the title suggests. And the lights become actually an instrument. They're like changing the amplification of the other instrument. So it becomes this like dependent relationship that there are always 2 performers in pairs. One is making the sound, but the other one is amplifying it. So like, so yeah, they become dependent on each other. And so yeah, in that sense, the light actually becomes like a very, well, it becomes an instrument. And then later in the piece, I am exploring this a little bit differently. For me, it's the same relationship, but it uses like different objects. So like I'm using microphones as instruments. So where the performers are pointing the microphones, this changes what is being amplified or what is being feedbacking. So for me, it's all like, okay, you have these 3 performers that are playing, actually they are playing the dynamics and the other performers are totally dependent on them. For me, it's like, I don't use technology for the sake of technology. And I'm not necessarily thinking like, okay, I want to make something super technically advanced. I don't think this is super technically advanced. Of course, it uses technology, but it's rather simple, I think, or at least it's very transparent in how it works. But for me, it's just like I can present my idea through a cello, but that's a particular idea, and not all ideas can be presented through a cello. And I think for me, it's like, because I'm always thinking about these relationships, you become a bit maybe dependent on using tools that are connected, and then technology becomes very handy. So in this case, it's the performers are playing strobe lights, and the light is being pointed at a light sensor, and then this light sensor, the message is translated to change the dynamics. So yeah, in this case, it's like, it's not using the technology because I wanted to use this particular technology, but rather that the idea as it develops required this technology to create this relationship. I think the process of writing this piece was, it's a little bit of a collage of different ideas that share the same relationship, that I've then been trying to think like, how do they come together, and in what way are they exploring the same relationship? So in a way, part of the idea came early on when I was asked to write a piece for Modelo62. But also a part of it later on was like, oh, I have this experiment that I did a couple of months ago that would really fit into this. And it's in a way the same. So yeah, so it's a bit hard because like I find it very important to like be playful in my work. So I'm always like trying just to have time to just like, I improvise a lot, and just try to find things to play around with. So many of these things have like yeah, most of the material has been created just in like playful exploration, and then trying to figure out how that can be used. And then maybe the final part of the process is like that I really must create the structure in my head, and I'm making these kind of outlines for a really long time, and thinking how things come together and how they are structured over time. But actually then, for example, the parts that the musicians are playing is rather simple. And that's actually the last part. And that's like really funny because that's maybe actually the music. But then it's just like, okay, they should play sounds that are like this, like they should be in the lower register, mid-low register, and they should have these characteristics. And it's like, so it's very much like I know what I'm looking for, but then I kind of just need to decide. It becomes very much like painting by numbers, that it's just kind of like, okay, I already have the structure, and then you have to fill in the rest to make a complete piece. And also for the also people that are involved. And in this case it's musicians, so it needs to be a score. So then you have to fill in the score to be readable for them. So I have three to four musicians, like electric guitar, cello, double bass, and piano. And then there are three performers that are first performing with strobe lights and gestures, and then later on they're performing microphones. And yeah, I mean, it's very crucial part of the piece actually, because it's like that's the primary way for me to explore these relationships. And I don't think this would be possible in any way just with instruments. Like it just becomes this like way to link, to bridge the audible and the visual perspective together, and through the through gestures and space in a way. So yeah, these become like objects that are performed, and then in a way they become instruments when they're performed. But for me, yeah, they're like crucial in exploring these relationships that this piece is exploring, which is dynamics, both audible ones and visual ones and gestural ones. Yeah, I mean, I have never studied neither directing or choreography, but I worked a lot with dancers. I think I've learned a lot from that in like how to guide people into performing. Ezekir suggested me actually at some point to make tutorial videos, which I thought about a lot. And then I was talking with Jessie Marino, who also does that a lot. And she was mentioning also her problems with it, that it becomes so literal, which is like, if you want to be fully in control of what people do, it's great. If you don't, it's not good. And I think for me, I really like working with people, and I use performers when I don't want robots or computers, you know. So like for me, it's very important that people just interpret it a little bit in their own way, and they also explore it, because that's very valuable for me. Because they will probably discover something that I don't know, and that's my favorite part. So yeah, there are performative elements, or like kind of movements. They are in some way notated, but it's purposely a little bit vague. And then I use a lot of illustrations, especially for like practicalities, like especially for things that are set up that need to be clear, but also a little bit for the performers to get a little bit understanding of what they're doing. But yeah, I don't like, especially if it's like a score that I'm bringing to a rehearsal, I don't like it to be too literal, because I do really enjoy kind of directing people on the spot, and I am interested in their interpretation. And of course, it becomes this, when there's a score, it becomes this gap. But I'm also interested in see like how that will work. Yeah, I hope for the audience that it's will be interesting to see like polyrhythms in light, and this that these relationships between the sound and light will create something, an interesting effect. For me, it's very appealing that the ensemble is very diverse, that they're very open for very different type of works. They're all excellent musicians, but I also really like that they do a lot of things that are like out of their own comfort zone, with different objects and performative elements. So that's very exciting for me, because yeah, this piece uses both instruments and the light and microphones as instruments. So it's important to have performers that are open for that.